Good morning. My name is Jane Lomax-Smith. I'm the chair of the Dunstan Foundation, and I'm really delighted to welcome so many of you from around the world to this session. We're halfway through Homelessness Week, and you can imagine that there are changes in the way we're operating, so we're all in different places. None of our speakers are together. Those two of us are in Adelaide. I'm actually in Victoria Square in the heart of Adelaide, so it's appropriate that I should acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, who are the Kaurna people, and no doubt those of you who are in other places might reflect on the traditional owners of your location as well. The theme for Homelessness Week this year is Everybody Needs a Home, and it's not just relevant to South Australia and Australia. I think that the last few months have exposed the fault lines in the way we operate across the world. And in these challenging times, there have been new solutions and suddenly unexpected results from actions taken in places that haven't otherwise been active in this area. We're really delighted to have Dr. Nonie Brennan back with us. Well, I say with us, she is actually in Ontario, and she's speaking to us in the evening, her time, and I'm just so grateful she could join us. She was here in November as Thinker in Residence. And we're also joined by Dr. Chris Leishman, who's the Director of the Centre for Housing and Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Adelaide. I should say that the University of Adelaide are one of our most important partners, along with Flinders University, and we're really delighted to have him here. So we're going to discuss today several issues around this year, the COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges and what it has meant for governments and organisations in this space, the solutions that many people have developed during the pandemic, some of which have been fabulously cross-sectoral, and all of them have been unusual and creative, and in fact the future impact that this year might have for those experiencing homelessness and how we might manage it into the future. So I'll begin by giving a more formal introduction to Nonie. You probably know that helping neighbours come home has been a driving force in our former Thinker in Residence's career. She's held a whole range of roles, but has brought a visionary systems change perspective and a grassroots collaborative approach that drives efficiency, shares learning, aligns funding, and increases positive community outcomes. In 2003, Dr. Brennan was the executive director of the Emergency Fund in Chicago in the US. And under her leadership, this emergency fund grew to become the largest provider of homelessness prevention funding in the state of Illinois. In 2011, she became the CEO of All Chicago Making Homelessness History, where she served until her retirement last year. Under her guidance, All Chicago grew to become a national and internationally recognized leader in proven practices that prevent and end homelessness. Notably, Dr. Brennan's leadership has resulted in massive funding for this sector, $70 million in public and private funding to prevent and end homelessness across the Chicago system, and also implemented Chicago's Plan 2.0, a home for everyone, in partnership with Chicago's Department of Family and Support Services. So she's had enormous experience, and we're really delighted that she's been a Thinker in Residence. So the first question, and I'll ask Chris shortly, so what has COVID taught us about homelessness?
So for us in Canada and for other places around the world, one of the first things that happened when we learned about this pandemic was that we were told to stay home. And so COVID has taught us that when you tell people to stay home for their own safety and for the safety of others, we need to ensure that people have a home to go to. COVID taught us that we can end homelessness, because during COVID, we experienced rapid change in the world of homelessness. We saw incredible things happen to reduce homelessness. And this tells us without a doubt that it is indeed possible to end homelessness. And what COVID has taught us about homelessness is the magic of political will. Governments stepped up in ways that they never have and were able to fill many of the gaps and break down many of the barriers that kept people homeless. And they were able to do it in record time. So when we think about what we learned that we do need to be focusing on making sure everybody has a home, that we can indeed end homelessness, and that the role of government is very important in doing that.
The same question of Chris, and Chris comes with a very special perspective for us in that he's a housing economist, and he's director of the Centre for Housing, Urban and Regional Planning at the Uni of Adelaide, and he's currently the editor of Urban Studies, a journal which is important in this field. He's previously been Housing Studies Editor-in-Chief, and he's undertaken a large number of studies and led numerous consultancies for private sector firms, third and public sector organisations. He's informed UK government policy on housing supply and affordability, but perhaps he's best known for his contributions to understanding the economics of new build housing supply, the linkages between housing supply and housing affordability, and modelling the housing system as a complex interaction between demographic, housing, labour market, housing supply, and migratory dynamics. Professor Leishman has very recently made a significant contribution to a project funded by the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, AHURI as it's called, on modelling housing needs in Australia. Chris, would you like to answer the same question? What do you think COVID has taught us?
Thanks, Jane. So yes, coming from a very different background, but I think I have to agree completely with Nonie's comments there, that actually the most remarkable thing we've seen in the COVID pandemic so far has been actually how readily fixable rough sleeping actually was when the political desire was there and when every level of government has been mobilised. So one of the things I've been doing over the last couple of months is participating in an international network called the More Different Futures Network. And it's a sort of a series of bilateral discussions between Canadian and Australian and Canadian and UK government and not-for-profit policymakers and researchers. And in the course of those discussions, some real experts on homelessness research have commented. So Stephen Getz in Canada, Hal Pawson in Sydney, and Suzanne Fitzpatrick in the UK ran a great session a couple of months ago looking at homelessness. And all three of those experts commented on actually how quickly different levels of government were able to act during this public health crisis and what a difference that made. So my personal reflection is that, you know, it's a pity in many ways it actually took a pandemic to bring about that course of action. That's what was required. But now that it's actually happened, I think that politicians and the public at large are never going to be able to forget how much was achieved in a very short space of time. And so my hope is that this might lead to longer lasting change and a better longer term solution when the use of emergency accommodation comes to an end, which it will in due course. But I think there's a second point on the theme of economics that you mentioned, Jane, and I think this point was summarised really well by Lydia Teixeira from Crisis in one of these online discussions. And she pointed out that in the UK, it actually costs something like £20 million to emergency house 5,000 people just for 2 months. And it would have cost something like 5 million to use the private rental sector instead. And that sum of money actually includes provision of support services. So I think the two take-home messages for me are that rough sleeping was actually fixable all along, but it took a pandemic to trigger action. And then secondly, most importantly, I think, it's actually much cheaper from an economic point of view to find longer term solutions than crisis solutions to rough sleeping.
I think the other part of that is that rough sleepers cost a lot of money because they use a lot of other services. So that's another factor. Thank you. So Nonie, can I ask you another question about the greatest challenge for organisations and governments and the way people's views of homelessness have changed, because there's been a societal change in the way we look at these people, and that's possibly been able to underpin the government's change in their actions as well.
Yeah. So I think we've seen a reduction in the stigma of homelessness, and it may come from people's own fear that everybody now has this common fear of COVID. And we all now have something in common that we can look at, and it is very much part of our day-to-day life. And so in many ways, the playing field for what will happen with COVID equalizes us all. And we're now all vulnerable to COVID, and none of us have control over it. And so I think it brings something that makes all of us have something that is in common instead of looking at just what's different about us. I think the other thing that has changed the perspective is this real concept of the importance of home. When you're told to go home and stay home and be safe at home and isolate at home, it really changes what home means, and it really brings home for us this idea of what safety is and where safety is and what being safe is about. And I think certainly in the US and in Canada over the last several months, there has been a lot of media attention brought to the challenges facing people who are experiencing homelessness. And we've seen a lot of news coverage about the solutions that are being employed during COVID for people who are experiencing homelessness. And this has really made people more aware of what is happening, about how it is impacting people who are experiencing homelessness. And I think this has really helped change the stigma around that and helped people be sort of more empathetic about people who are experiencing homelessness. So I think that has been a change in the perspective that people have about homelessness.
Can I just follow up, thank you, Nonie, with another question. What do you think has been the challenge for organisations then in responding to homelessness during this pandemic?
Well, I actually think it's been more of an opportunity that maybe hasn't existed in the past. So certainly all of the same challenges exist, but we've had some opportunity to approach those challenges differently during COVID that we didn't have when COVID wasn't around.
Can I ask just a question? Does everyone have a by name system so that they can be found, these people that are homeless?
No, they don't. And that's one of the things that we saw work really well in Adelaide, was that they already had a by name list. And so places that sort of had some elements of addressing the issue of homelessness in place have done better and have moved forward, more quickly, I think, than some communities and places that didn't have things like that in place.
Thank you, Nonie. So, Chris, could I ask you the next question? What positive solutions have you seen from organisations and individuals and governments during these times? Perhaps some of them have surprised you.
Yeah, well, I've been reflecting on this for years, actually, but I think that one of the most sort of unhelpful problems in housing policy historically really has been separation of responsibilities between different levels of government. So I think that housing problems, including homelessness, quite often fall between the cracks, with different levels of government believing that actually the problems belong somewhere else. The solutions lie in another level of government to fix. And so reflecting on the pandemic, there's evidence from Australia, UK, North America as well, that different levels of government pull together really effectively. And so I think that national government exerted quite strong leadership in the UK, for example, and also in Australia. And that's been commented on by lots of international researchers recently. I mean, in Australia, the operation of a national cabinet was really well received during the early stages of the pandemic. And it's almost as though something's changed in our actual understanding of the relationship between national and state level government leadership. So my hope is that after the pandemic, we'll be taking a step in the direction of a stronger set of housing policies actually led at national level. My worry, though, is that when the urgency of the pandemic begins to decline, then we could lose momentum, or it could degenerate into an argument about who pays for what. And we're already seeing, for example, very different responses from state governments in terms of economic stimulus and housing interventions. So I'd like to see us regain the initiative and move towards a stronger sort of set of national policies before that momentum's lost.
Thank you. Well, I think you've highlighted that things might not continue in this vein. The next question is really what can communities at large do to ensure that the work continues after the crisis? Would you like to answer that, Chris, as you're speaking?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I think that most commentators and researchers now share a view that it's really difficult to imagine a return to large numbers of people sleeping rough after the pandemic ends, now that we've seen it's fixable, at least broadly. And of course, that's assuming the pandemic does end at some point, because it seems to come and go. And most people realize there's no going back to the old way of life that existed before the pandemic, quite like it was before. And generally that's seen as a bad thing, of course. But there might be an opportunity to take a positive, because I think we've actually taken an important step in saying that people might actually have a right to be housed. And that's never really been explicitly acknowledged in Australia, but it might happen soon, this realization that people have a right to be housed. But at the moment, there's no clear plan about what will actually happen to people who are currently housed in temporary accommodation. And there's been no announcement of a large-scale public house building program in Australia as yet. So my own view is that time is precious. There's a danger of the opportunity slipping away. Unless there's a significant investment in affordable and public house building program in Australia, we're going to lose an opportunity.
So I think it's a global situation, Nonie. So you've seen some positive solutions.
Yeah, well, one of the things we've seen really around the world in places that have been addressing the issue of homelessness during COVID is we've really seen better coordination of programs and services between government and non-governmental organizations. And we've seen how critical that coordination is in impacting the significant community issue of homelessness. And we've seen real political will, as mentioned before, in solving this issue, certainly during COVID. And with that political will came badly needed resources that have helped to be able to move this issue forward. And we know how critical political will is in impacting significant community issues like homelessness. I was chatting with the CEO of the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness yesterday, and he said to me, in every city where we've seen a reduction in the number of people experiencing homelessness and where we've seen really good positive work in addressing the issue of homelessness, we've seen one thing that's been consistent, and that's really good leadership. And so we know that leadership and really good leadership is critical in impacting significant community issues like homelessness. But when we look around the world at the work to end homelessness that's been happening during COVID, there is one country that has really shone above the rest in their success in impacting the significant community issue of homelessness, and that's the UK. They really set the model for the world. Within 3 weeks in March, the UK housed 15,000 people who were experiencing homelessness. They housed everybody that was sleeping rough in the entire country. Now, they did this in temporary housing, just like we saw in other communities where they were using hotels and they were using student residents and they were using hostels. But they were really able to get folks off the street and into a safe place to be during COVID. And they did that by having really good leadership, and Dame Louise Casey, who a lot of people in Australia and elsewhere in Adelaide know, because she's been there several times, working with communities to look at how to end homelessness, has led the effort in the UK. So there was really good leadership. There was really good coordination between government and non-governmental organizations. There was incredible political will, and they had good data. So these elements really work together to be able to reduce the number of people on the street. And now they have an incredible focus to be able to make sure everybody that they have temporarily housed is going to be permanently housed. And the last time I checked, they had already identified 6,000 units of permanent housing that were going to be online or brought online to be able to house everybody who was temporarily housed. So they are really moving forward in a way that we have not seen at the same level in other countries.
So the next question is, how do we encourage other places to do the same thing? I don't know that there's an answer to that, Nonie, or do you think there's anything communities can do to stop us sliding backwards?
So I think it's really about making sure that all of the elements that we already knew needed to be in place if we wanted to address the issue of homelessness are in place. It's honing those leading practices and making sure that communities have them. And this work to end homelessness is really about systems change, and the elements that need to be in place to end homelessness are the same. It's about setting a goal, and during COVID, we have seen communities set goal to get everybody who's rough sleeping off the street and into temporary housing, or they've set goals where they want to make sure that people who are in shelters are spread out or have space, or they've expanded shelter space and temporary housing space. It's having that by name list that we already talked about, which identifies everybody who needs to be on a path to housing. It's about having that public-private partnership and working together. It's having a collective approach where everybody who's impacted by the issue of homelessness is working together to solve it. It's about making sure that there are housing solutions in place for everybody. Not everybody needs a 3-bedroom house. Not everybody needs a 1-bedroom apartment. It's knowing what people need and then getting them on a path to secure that housing. It's about having outreach workers and housing specialists who are trained and equipped to do this work and do it well. And it's about having data that helps you understand what's happening in your community and using that data to drive change. So it's really about making sure these leading practice elements are in place to be able to move the work forward.
Thank you. So coming back to Chris for the next question about the other important parts of the jigsaw, how should or could the other sectors like health, employment, education, and even food security be working with the housing sector to actually underpin the success of this strategy into the future?
I'm not so sure about those other sectors, Jane, but what I would say is there's a tremendous opportunity at the moment, because the housing system does have an incredible amount of capacity, which is unused, and so I see an opportunity. And I'll give 2 examples. When at the last census, Australia had more than 1 million empty dwellings on census night. We've got 114,000 homeless people. So what, just 10% roughly of those empty dwellings could solve the problem. So, the housing system doesn't have a shortage. It's just that in Australia, people tend to own several houses or none. So we obviously have an allocation problem in this country. And I think, a second point I'd raise is if it wasn't for housing homeless people on a temporary basis and also people in quarantine, you know, Australia's hotel industry would be completely empty. You know, hotels would be completely empty at the moment. So as a quick calculation, I think, you know, 12,000 homeless people currently housed in that sector, and you know, about 10,000 returning foreign travelers in quarantine is making up something like 20% of all of the entire capacity of that sector at the moment. And that's before we even look at other redundancies, Airbnb, short-term private rentals, an oversupply of student accommodation, which is currently a lot of it's lying vacant. And so we are seeing lots of opportunities for restructuring the housing system and creating, you know, really quite phenomenal levels of new supply. So I think we could repurpose a lot of that system and actually address a lot of these unmet housing needs we have.
Thank you. Well, that sounds like an exciting opportunity. Could I just remind anybody listening to the webinar that there's a chat box, and if you have any questions, you can flick them up to us now and we'll try and answer them as we go along. So, Nonie, I just should ask you about those other sectors. You talk about housing first often, but these other sectors are important.
Yeah, so homelessness is a public health crisis, and that was a hard sell before COVID. But everyone understood immediately the threat to public health of COVID, and they saw how that impacted people who were experiencing homelessness. So interesting to me, we've seen recently in some communities like Chicago, where actually the public health department has taken over the work around homelessness. They're leading that work in coordination with all of the other organizations who work. They had never led the work around homelessness prior to COVID. And this is an indicator of how important it is for systems and social sectors to be working together and align and integrate their work. We know that unemployment and illness are two of the feeders into the homeless system. Therefore, we need to make sure that employment and health sectors are at the table when we're working on the crisis of homelessness. The concept of coordination when it comes to solving community issues means that everyone who touches or is affected by the issue are in the room when you're trying to solve that issue and find solutions to that issue. And it includes places like corrections and the jail system. We know from our work in Chicago that one of the feeders into the homeless system is the jail system. And unless we're working and integrating with the jail system, we're really missing an opportunity to be able to broadly affect the issue of homelessness. So it's absolutely critical to integrate systems that are being touched by the issue of homelessness.
I was at a session earlier in the week, and I think the figure was 10% of the by name street homeless people are from jails, directly out of jail. So it is relevant here. Thank you.
Understanding that is really important, because that is part of understanding the data that is affecting the inflow. And once you know that, then you can start to say, how can we bring solutions to that?
So we've had a couple of questions. One is, why can't we have a by housing named vacancy list? So we name every house that's empty. And the other question was, is it possible to mix tenancies in places like student accommodation? Maybe I should ask Chris that.
I'm not sure I understand the question about mixing tenancies, but
could you have homeless people housed in a student accommodation with students on other floors?
Yeah, well, you know, why not? I mean, in other jurisdictions, we have, for example, head leasing arrangements, which could be used very effectively. So in the UK, head leasing is used where, you know, a local government might take a lease on a private rental tenancy. It might be possible to take you know, a 10-year lease on a whole portfolio of private rental tenancies. And that takes away a management headache for small-scale mum and dad investors, sort of guarantees an income, and it gives the local authority sort of guaranteed number of bed spaces. It's much cheaper than using emergency accommodation. And we know that lots of universities are holding stock of student accommodation, and there's been an enormous boom in building purpose-built student accommodation over the last 10 years. And in many ways, the pandemic, you know, came at a disastrous time for universities. I'm commenting on universities internationally, you understand, and nothing to do with the University of Adelaide, about which I know nothing about its asset management strategy. But you know, universities around the world have actually built their finances partly on the receipt of student rental income. And now they're hurting badly because they don't have the international students coming on board. So there is a need to repurpose, I think, and an opportunity to repurpose whole blocks of housing. And head leasing arrangements could be used effectively. And you know, the common ground model shows it's possible to mix homeless people being rehoused with low-income people engaged in the workforce already. So why not adapt a similar model using student accommodation? I see no reason why not.
All optimistic, I think. Can I just ask about thinking forward? If there really is going to be a 30% unemployment level, as there is apparently in parts of the US, and if this is the biggest recession that's ever been recorded, surely we're going to have job insecurity. It's going to affect people's capacity to stay in rental accommodation. And surely there's going to be more homelessness, isn't there, in the next 12 months? Chris?
Yeah, I mean, this really is the million-dollar question for me. What's going to happen? You know, the truth is that no one has any idea what the future holds for the economy or the housing system, but, you know, the outlook is pretty bad. In Australia, for example, we know that the global economy is turning down, and the Australian economy is really dependent on exports, particularly of, you know, agricultural output and mining output. So Australia is going to be hit hard. But the bit that no one really understands actually is that the economic pain is very concentrated at the moment on a smallish number of sectors. And if we think about what happens in a typical recession, if there's any such thing as a typical recession, they tend to follow a certain pathway where the pain begins in financial and business service sector. So financial markets start turning down, confidence falls. And so these high productivity sectors get hit first. And then, if you like, the contagion spreads elsewhere in the economy. But what's happened here is completely the opposite. So the retail sector, tourism, hospitality, leisure, all of the public facing sectors were hit immediately. And there isn't really any precedent for knowing how that damage to those sectors will spread to the rest of the economy. I mean, it might or might not happen. We don't really know. There isn't really any evidence from past recessions. But I think the biggest danger is actually that the lowest income workers, those on casual contracts, those with no job security, they're actually going to end up even worse off after this downturn than before. And so, you know, a second thing that happens typically in recessions is when an economy begins to grow, you tend to find that the gap between the wealthiest and the poorest gets larger. And so towards the end of a boom, the gap between the wealthiest and poorest is very large indeed. And then a recession sort of narrows the gap again. So what we've seen is years and years of economic growth in Australia, during which the gap has been widening between the wealthiest and the poorest. And this downturn is actually accelerating that gap. So it's not returning to any equilibrium. It's not narrowing the gap. It's actually making it wider. So my fear is that income inequality and deprivation will actually grow even wider during this downturn because of its concentration on lowest income, most precarious workers.
So that's a concern. What could we do? Nonie, what do you think about that issue of the future being with more income inequality and the looming recession, job insecurity?
So this is what we're all worried about, is what the future is going to bring and the uncertainty about the future. So one of the things that we know is that homelessness is affected by poverty. And, you know, in many situations, people who, I think we will see things like we saw during the Great Depression, where people will move in with family members, and families will start to double up. And what we will see is that it's really the people who are at the lowest level of the economic, you know, the economic stream will end up in homelessness. I mean, we're hearing things now like an increase of 45% in the number of people experiencing homelessness in the US. And whether that is really true or whether that's extreme, it's hard to tell. But certainly people who are at the lower end of the economic level are probably going to be more likely to come into the homeless system. And whether the homeless system is prepared to handle that, we're going to see. But it's something we're all afraid about, because we just don't really know what's going to happen yet.
Chris, is it cheeky to ask if the economists have a solution?
A solution to what, Jane?
To the risk of looming recession and job insecurity affecting the poor?
I mean, honestly, we know we're flying towards the edge of a cliff, but no one really knows quite what to do they? And there are many interacting problems in Australia. So one problem, of course, is that we have a very large private rental sector. And a lot of the people who've lost their jobs or had reduced hours are in that rental sector. And we've got a moratoria on evictions, which is great, but they're going to end soon. They're going to end in the next few months. And there's a worry about what will happen. Will we see a large scale rise in evictions when that happens? We also know that the government's encouraged landlords and tenants to discuss reduced rental payments, but we also know that those debts aren't forgiven. So any tenant who's got a reduction in rent at the moment is actually essentially building for debt that they're expected to repay at some point. It's not that they've been let off this rent. So they've lost their job, and they've got reduced income, the debt's rising, and the moratoria on evictions will end. I mean, that's a potential disaster in the making. But we also know that the tax system in Australia has encouraged small-scale mum and dad investors. And you know, a lot of people have done the right thing. The government directed them to invest heavily in the housing market, so they've got negatively geared properties. And so there's a worry that actually there's a sort of house of cards out there. There could be a lot of people with heavily leveraged investments. Their tenants have lost their jobs. They can't pay the rent. They themselves may have lost one of their incomes as well. So they're struggling to pay their own home loan and their investment home loan. The whole thing could come crashing down very easily. So it really does need an urgent analysis and some really firm action, I think, from different levels of government before this crisis actually hits us.
Thank you. I recognise that we're getting close to cut-off time and other people have places to go to. I just ask one question. Is it safe for rough sleepers to be overcrowded, or in fact people to move into other people's homes, because then they'll be increasing the risk of contagion? Nonie, you were saying people are going to double up. Will that possibly increase the risk of COVID?
Well, I think it's how do we expand bubbles safely? And I think we started to see that happen as things have started to release a little bit. But I think certainly what's important for communities is that we're testing and tracking who is, you know, COVID positive, and that we have a good healthcare system behind this, so that we're making sure that we're able to do everything possible from that end. I think one of the things that we have seen, you know, during COVID is this movement to sort of separate people and keep them separated. But I would assume that if we're going to move into a time period where people are going to start to need to move in together and so on, that we're going to do that in a responsible way where we know that we're taking the precautions that need to be in place.
Thank you. Well, can I just say that I've got the impression that we can give a big tick to lots of governments. They've done the right thing in the crisis. They've moved quickly. They've poured money into the system. We're heading towards the cliff, but we're all optimistic because we know there are vacancies out there, and there might be innovative ways to fill those vacancies and keep people's finances afloat. So there are positive ideas on the horizon. We'd love to hear feedback from any of the people listening. I know some of you will have an opportunity to come online and see the film later, the video later. You might like to make comments or ask questions. If you've asked questions and we haven't answered them, we'll be emailing you back with that. I should thank you for coming here this morning, but I must thank our sponsors as well. I've mentioned the University of Adelaide and Flinders University, who have been fabulous supporters over many years, but also this is all an initiative of a great collaboration between the state government and the Adelaide City Council, our capital city, because the cabinet members and members of council work together, and this is them recognising this is a shared problem for which they're finding shared solutions. If you'd like to follow more of the events, you go onto the website dunstan.org.au, and there's also you'll find some editorial comment on there as well. So can I thank Nonie and Chris? It's been fabulous speaking to you, and thank you so much for giving up your time. I can see it's getting dark in Ontario, whereas Chris and I are just getting geared up for the day. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you. Goodbye.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.